Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's 2 o'clock. No, it's 1 o'clock, 10 past 1 on my time here. And I think it's the same for you. So I am really excited to talk to about this topic today on mobilization and disinformation because it's something close to my heart, and also it's been a main agenda of my research for the past 10 years or so. Um, Let me, I guess, give an outline of what we'll be doing today. So I would like to actually start first by sort of elaborating what the public sphere means in the context of new media, right, for the first hour or so. And this has actually implications in terms of how we think about mobilization and disinformation. These two are words that we hear very often these days, right? In the second hour or so, I'll talk about mobilization and social media, right? Especially in the context of more current social movements that we see today. And finally, I will end off with a rather dismal note, which is about disinformation. So at any point, I would like to encourage you to post your questions in the chat, or if you have a question, just feel free to raise your hand and uh, or just stop me. Okay, I'll be happy to explain, because I know that there's a lot of concepts I'm introducing today which may be quite heavy, so do let me know if I'm going too fast. Okay, so let me oh, Sophia is here. Hi, Sophia. Okay.
Sorry
uh
about it.
no worries. No worries. Okay, let me start by talking about the public sphere. um what is the public sphere? Just a show of hands in the room, right? How many of you have heard of this term? Or
Yes.
yes? Okay, Sophia has.
Raise it.
Uh, yeah, I wasn't sure if anyone in the room raised their hands.
Yeah, raise it.
You want to explain what you understand by the public sphere?
um, yeah, it's similar to what is on this slide, but basically it's a place where there is that individuals they are aware of. And it's a place that is accessible to like-minded people.
Yeah.
Yeah, or
So
even
yeah, that's right. Thank you. Thanks, Sophia. So the idea of the public sphere actually came from a very long time ago from Aristotle, right? If you've ever been to Greece, right? You know there is like a very famous square down there, right? I mean, it goes back to this ancient idea that there is a certain space where, yeah, citizens, basically, citizens of the any society, right? So long as they are citizens there, they have issues or matters or to discuss that should concern everyone, right? The public sphere is conceived of as a space where all these issues can be brought up, and people's opinions and ideas can be actually discussed about these issues, right? So the public sphere is not just a place to express opinions. It's also a place for people to hear about the opinions of other people, right? So it is two-way, right? So that, right, if you actually went into the public sphere with no sense of what to think about a topic or issue, after hearing about other people's opinion, you should be able to actually form an opinion on your own, right? So in ancient civilizations, the public sphere is usually thought of as a town hall, a square, right, or even the parliament, right? It's thought of as physical spaces. And with the arrival of the internet, okay, even before the internet, the media is seen quite often as a way to actually shape the public sphere through the kinds of news that the media covers, right? And even the way they actually discuss these issues. So the media is a key player in shaping what the public sphere um, looks like what people think and what kinds of issues, right, are considered as important. However, with the internet, right, I think I'm borrowing this slide from a series of dialogue that I have conducted in Singapore, right, where with the internet, right, this sense of what uh, kinds of topics are important, how we talk about them, this sense of the public sphere has changed a lot, right? Quite often these days, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, right? But many of us actually check out what our friends are thinking, what even our fellow citizens are thinking about the president, the prime minister, about this problem and that issue, right? By looking up on it on the internet. We look to social media, right? We check out Facebook, we check out Twitter, to actually understand, to check out what people are saying as well as what people are thinking, right? To get us that sense of what people are thinking. So the public sphere is no longer a physical space. It's no longer a town hall, or rather, no longer limited to a physical space, right? It is actually something that is very much, it exists in all kinds of forms. It is, I like to think of it as fragmented and hybrid, right? Where uh, agendas and all that, they continue to be surfaced through media and opinion leaders as well as people who are important, right, and influential in each society. But at the same time, we also have lots of actually citizens who are internet users that continue to shape all this agenda and all that. Of course, that is a very democratic way to look at it, right? But it also comes with certain pitfalls, which I'll get into later, right? Especially with the proliferation of disinformation campaigns and misinformation, when it's no longer um, very possible to tell at a glance whether something's fake or something's not fake, right? So, but yeah, I mean, the whole topic of mobilization and disinformation, to me, has very much to do with the public sphere, which is why I wanted to start with this note, right? So I hope that by now all of you understand what is the public sphere, right? Quite immediately, I think in your own context, you can think of spaces. Particular, it could be a particular uh, a platform or forum on the internet, right, that you consider to be to make up the public sphere in your own society, right? It could even be a town hall, right? It could even be a physical space as well. Um, right. So now, is this actually a positive or not so positive, right? Let me start with the positive. I think now that we have the internet, right, that forms part of our public sphere, we actually have a tremendous opportunity to gain access to much more information. I think that's very straightforward. I don't have to belabor this point, right? We have the ability to hear from not just a few elite people, right? We actually have the opportunity to hear from anyone, like, right, that has an opinion, so long as they express it. We have that ability to gain access to their thoughts, to their opinions, to the kinds of information they have to offer, right? Of course, whether or not we actually go and seek all this information out is a separate issue, right? But my main point on this slide is just how rich and diverse, right, the kinds of information we have in our public sphere. Now, uh, this slide, um, I wanted to show you, right, just how with the internet, the sort of digital public sphere has changed, right? Now on your left is the pre-internet age of idea of the public sphere, right? You have the public, right? These are your fellow citizens and so on. And you have actually sometimes the public actually coming together to form an assembly, right? To form a team or form a civil society group, for instance, and they surface issues. Of course, like in Singapore, we have quite a number of people who are very concerned about heritage and environment. because yeah, rightfully so, because Singapore is such a small place, right? So people here are very concerned about the erasure and removal of spaces. So they come together and form like a sort of civil society group, right? This is what we call a team public, right? And then but yeah, the issues they care about, right, may not always actually be something that is circulated or surfaced to the wider public, right? Here's where the media comes in, right? The journalist comes in, the broadcaster comes in, right? As a sort of a gatekeeper, right? And if they choose to cover the issue that they care about, right, that publication provides that wider coverage. The issue becomes an agenda that is circulated to the public, to the masses, right? Of course, right? This does mean that, again, this is a pre-internet era, right? When the media does not come in, right, to actually surface or cover these issues. Sometimes these issues just continue to get uh, sort of contained, right, within that civil society group. It does not ever actually become something that the public, the wider public cares about, right? Now that's actually the public sphere, before the internet. Now I'd like you to turn your attention to the figure on the right, right? So now what does it look like? Um, if you notice, right, the individual actually becomes actually at the bottom, right? Because the individual now actually can essentially publish without having to form any kind of group anymore, right? You still have the counter public, you still have the civil society groups that can come together, right? Uh, to form what we call a team public, right? You still have the media that can cover these issues and actually circulate this agenda. But unlike the previous figure, or rather the previous picture, right, where there is a certain flow going from the counter public, the team public, right, going up to the media, where the media actually plays a gatekeeper role, right, in circulating what is important, what is not. Right now, everyone, including the individual, right, can publish their agenda, can express an opinion, can assess what's important and relevant uh, without the media, right? Because of this access to the internet. So long as you have access to the internet, you have devices and platforms that allows you to create content, you can be actually contributing to the public sphere, right? So this is really, I think, why I said earlier that with the arrival of the internet, right, the public sphere has changed a lot, right? Where it's not that the media disappears completely. I would say that their role is now much more two-way, right? Where they actually constantly still kind of surface the agenda through their interactions with the civil society groups, right, that's formed under the team publics. But at the same time, they are also being checked by the individuals and the civil society groups who also have the same kinds of access, right? So one example, right, of this kind of two-way uh, interaction and two-way checking, right, is when, for instance, in when the media, right, covers a certain issue or topic, right, and if that coverage is not has been selective, or the coverage has been actually more focused on one part and not comprehensive enough, right, that group or any individual can essentially write a counter argument, right, to question the coverage of the media. That did that was not possible in the past, right? In the pre-internet era. So I hope you get this actually a big picture of what I mean by how the internet has actually changed the public sphere by now, right? Now, what are the implications? Just to summarize here, right? The first implication is, of course, agenda setting. It is no longer up to the media or just a few individuals to shape the issues that matter and how these issues are discussed. Secondly, right, social networks matter more than ever, right? The kinds of social networks that you belong to, it shapes what kind of topics or issues or agenda you come across, you encounter, what kind of discourse that you are exposed to or you participate in. It shapes your social networks, shape the kind of sense making, right, that takes place, right, when you are trying to make sense of certain movements or certain topics of the day. It also shapes the types of participation and mobilization, right, that that actually surfaces in your social network, right? So on this note, whether or not your social network is homogeneous or actually diverse enough, right, really matters, right? Because when your when everyone that's part of your social network are also people who think exactly and like you, or has interest that's exactly like you, the likelihood of you encountering a perspective that is different, right? Or a perspective or even a topic, right? That's outside of your immediate interest, right? Is quite low. So unless you have other ways to actually diversify this kind of social networks, right? So now that I've talked about the implications, right? Let me turn to the topic of mobilization. Yeah, and this is the exciting part, right? Uh, it is actually, I think, without me really explaining on it, right? I think all of you should know, right, by now that the it is almost on an everyday basis that we encounter some kind of internet facilitated movements, right? And the kinds of virality and the spread as well, right? Is not limited, no longer limited to its geographical, is no longer limited by geographical constraints. So let me actually talk about a few cases, right? That's on this slide. So in on the top left, you can see how this is actually a picture of the first 12 hours of the global use of hashtag me too, right, across more social media platforms. So I think most of you should be familiar with what the me too movement is, right? In fact, before this particular hashtag got viral, right? Actually, it was invented. An activist came up with it actually way before, you know, it got viral, right? But it got viral, right? Largely because of Alyssa Millandro, right? Who is a celebrity, right? Tweeted that famous tweet, right? Yeah, if you've ever been had actually an encounter where you've actually been sexually harassed, right? Yeah, me too, right? And that's the famous tweet that got the world going, right? And if you look at actually the first 12 hours, right? Of global Me Too usage, you can see that, of course, because the very first instance of hashtag Me Too usage, right, was in the United States. You can see that, yeah, the coverage was actually quite significant there, right? The United States, yeah, and North America, right, I would say, right, saw widespread use of Me Too, hashtag Me Too. But within 12 hours, it spread across, right? It actually went across the globe. So this just, I guess, illustrates my point about how viral, how social movements, or rather, social media facilitated movements are no longer limited by geographical, constraints. Um, I would say also though that context matter. So going back to actually Me Too in Singapore, right? It actually, it wasn't until the a particular Instagram series, right, of posts started, right? That Me Too actually came to Singapore, right? I think people in Singapore actually were aware of hashtag Me Too, were aware of people using this, but it never really picked up, right? Until there was actually an US student, right, who Monica Bay, who used Instagram to share her personal story of um, um, yeah, being sexually harassed, right, on Instagram. And that's when it started to hit home, right, and people started uh, yeah, actually posting uh, more frequently, right, and really started engaging with the issue of sexual harassment. So this actually is Me Too, right? Of course, I still remember actually take a knee movement, right? This is actually a movement that is quite uniquely American, right? I still remember examining your student Trisha, right, who studied this movement. And then there are also, of course, a number of uh, yeah, hashtag or rather social media facilitated movements such as Pink Dot, Blackout Singapore, which is actually about freeing the internet, right? Or the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong, right? And so on. Okay, I'll come to some of these cases in a while, right? Um, so now, let me actually, I guess, give some overview of what are the actual effects of social media based on a systematic and meta review that I've done together with colleagues on the effects of social media on political, civic, and social engagement, right? So political engagement basically means whether or not, right, you participate in political activities such as, voting, such as volunteering for political parties, such as participating in rallies and so on. It is a bit different from civic engagement, and the main difference is just that civic engagement is not political, right? Civic engagement has more to do with whether or not you participate in social causes, right? Whether you volunteer your time for charities and so on. And social engagement is about social capital, whether or not social media has an effect on people building, right, their social capital, right? So based on a 10-year meta review, what I found is that social media do has and a significant effect, right? But the effect is quite small, especially in countries that already has other means of expression, has already other means of participation like freedom of assembly, right? But the effect is larger when it comes to certain societies where that are less democratic, right? In its social political system, right? For instance, in more authoritarian regimes, right? Social media actually has a more greater significant effect, right? Because this in these countries, these societies, right? There's no other ways, no other means of participation. The types of use actually is important as well, whether or not you use social media to express an opinion, to just read about other people's opinion, or just seek information, right? These different types, this is what I mean by different types of use, right? These different types of use has different implications. So obviously, if you use social media on a regular basis to express your opinion about different social political issues, it has a greater effect on your overall political engagement. However, right, contrast this with someone who use social media on a more informational basis, right? For that person, that kinds of informational use may not actually have, an effect on their political engagement. The affordances of different platforms actually is important as well. So whether or not people are using Facebook versus Twitter versus Instagram, right? It shapes the kinds of possibilities, right? The kinds of things that they do with these platforms. Yeah, again, the context matters. In certain countries, right? Even though Twitter is one of the most, I guess, free platform, right, with limited boundaries, right, limited rules, right, in terms of what you can use it for, right. It does not always mean that everyone will, in every society, will use it in the same way. The culture of expression matters, right? In the case of Singapore and other parts of Southeast Asia, where there are great cause, right, perceived with expressing an opinion, a political opinion especially, right? Even if people have that platform, it does not mean that they will use them, because that context will still matter very much. So so let me actually talk about now that I've talked about the overall effects, right? I like to actually uh, talk about two things that matter in terms of mobilization, right? When I talked about social media, right, we tend to think of them as, oh, we're just using social media to communicate with our family members and friends. But social media is not just that. It can be used for engaging in what I call collective sense making as well, right? And this kind of collective sense making, right, is incredibly important, especially when it comes to collective action. All kinds of mobilization, in its in a sense, right, is about actually people coming together to rally for change, or to actually call for some kind of some kind of mobilization, right? That will actually either protest something or change something, right? And this process is this act of coming together is what we call collective action. And without that collective sense making, without that collective communication, collective action will not be very meaningful, right? And yeah, and a lot of actually social movements that we see, right? Whether it's about Black Lives Matter, whether it is about Me Too, whether it is about calling for greater democracy, right, or demanding for greater democracy, it needs individuals to come together to I guess recognize that there is a problem here, right, and recognize that we need to actually do something about it. And that is what in the gist, what a social movement is all about. It's about a collective. It's about people, individuals, right, who collectively, right, want to promote or resist a change, right, in the society they are part of, right. And for them to actually even recognize that some action is needed on their part, right, there needs to be collective sense making between them. So now, why am I talking about this, right? During actually social movements, right, there's usually a lot of uncertainty, right, about whether what is the problem, or whether there is even a problem, right? And the attempt to actually make sense of this uncertainty, right, the very process, right, is can be actually understood as collective sense making, right? And there are two subcomponents of this, right? And these two components I will show you through an example of how it manifests in social media facilitated movements. And one of this is about milling, right? Milling the kinds of inputs, right? The kinds of points being made. And then after milling, right, usually milling actually leads to keynoting, right? And keynoting is about how we then actually make sense of all these points that have come about, right? So there are two key sub-concepts in sense making, right? As I mentioned, milling is about actually how everyone starts to, I guess, say that, oh, this is a problem, right? And a lot of these different voices, right, they are spontaneous. There's actually, they are actually coming through different kinds of channels and platforms. It is quite chaotic, right? But usually, after all these points are actually surfaced, right, keynoting is actually needed, right, to kind of make sense of them, right? And, keynoting is also the process when there's more unified, I guess, sense of what's happening here. Um, and let me actually illustrate, right, how this happens, right, before I talk about hashtagging. Yeah, so with a lot of social media, right, if you look at, going back to my example of Me Too, right, if I present to you the scenario, right, where people were just sharing, their stories of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, right, without the hashtag Me Too, right? How do we make sense of them, right? Of course, I think you can collect all these stories. You can try to, go on Twitter and make sense of all these stories that's coming through, right? But and that's your milling in process, right? But how did people in the actual Me Too movement actually make sense of them? Here I argue that this is where hashtags actually, as an affordance, as a key feature of new media, really is can be quite effective. And this is just one example of how an affordance of new media actually, participates or plays an important role in the kinds of mobilization that we see, right? As symbols, right? Hashtag actually helps people to help to draw attention, right, to the kinds of posts, to the kinds of stories, even the pictures that's tagged with the hashtag, right? It also helps with, going back to my earlier starting point about public sphere, right? Imagine if you're someone, in, this massive chaotic public sphere, you're someone trying to make sense of what is the problem here, right? Having this hashtag actually helps you to aggregate the kinds of information and retrieve the necessary posts that helps you to make sense of it, right? So hashtags actually work, plays an important role in terms of sense making as a symbol, but even as words, right? The actual words in the hashtag actually um, can be quite powerful as well, right? Me Too has been so powerful because it's not just a symbol, right? As words, the words Me Too, right? Sort of communicate a sense of collective, this sense of I am part of your world. You are not alone, right? These words in the hashtag actually expand the kinds of situational awareness, that expands the kind of understanding people can have on the scale of the problem. So when more and more people actually started using hashtag Me Too, right? It really make every post, every retweet with the hashtag Me Too, very powerful because, yeah, the words itself means that everyone who use this hashtag, uh, yeah, are essentially saying that I'm part of this movement. So hashtag itself actually as a feature of new media actually really has that effect of actually helping people to mobilize other people as well. But quite importantly, right, as I argue here, is also very effective in helping people make sense of what's the problem here and what's happening here, right? It's about discourse. So, I know I've talked about how sense making, right? Collective sense making is, essential to collective action, right? And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the collective action theory, right? But the traditional collective action theory, right, is this. It says that for meaningful collective action to happen, right, there needs to be some conditions. Firstly, everyone who participates need to have this sense of this sense of shared understanding of what is the problem, right, and what needs to be done. So the logic of collective action, right, is about how all participants, right, everyone who is part of this particular social movement, they need to resonate with each other, need to agree with each other that here's the problem and what we need to do about it. Change is necessary, right? Uh, Collective action, right, is, or in its traditional sense, is also very dependent on a few core activists to make things happen. So if you look at examples like the umbrella movement, for instance, right? By now, the umbrella movement has actually evolved very much, but in its beginnings, there were actually a few core activists, right? That were communicating the urgency, right, to actually do something about the problem, right? Who were also lending their faces and their presence to the movement, right? So collective action, in its traditional sense, is also reliant on that core activists, right? It could be a few individuals, right? It could also be an organization. Um, so that is actually, the traditional collective action theory, right? The So in a sense, right, collective action is about actually getting individuals to contribute to the collective, right, endeavor, to the shared movement, to the shared problem, right? And it's about getting individuals to kind of participate in what we understand as altruistic behavior. It means that they have to, if you think about it, everyone who participates in a protest, in a movement, they have to forego a certain uh, welfare for themselves to participate in what they recognize as a common or a public good. So yeah, that's actually collective action. But there are scholars like Bennett and Segerberg who believes that with new media, we are no longer just talking about collective action. Um, he, they came up with the words with a new theory called connective action. Let me explain it, right? And how it's different from more traditional understandings of collective action. So yeah, in the view of collective action, right? There are formal activists, formal organizations, right, with resources, right? And when I talk about resources, it's not just about monetary resources. Sometimes these resources are social networks, right? Because they have the ability to mobilize their influential activists sometimes, right? So they have the sort of social capital as resources to put people, mobilize other people, right? Sometimes these resources could also be logistical, right? Because it could be a wealthy individual or an organization that has the space to actually kind of coordinate individuals. I remember in Singapore when there used to be more. Actually, we saw a lot more collective action, right? There used to be student groups, right, that were activists in actually kind of coordinating people in various kinds of protests, right? Uh, this was actually, I think, back in the 50s and 60s, right? 1950s and 60s, when there was still a lot more collective action in society. But a lot of these student groups, they didn't have money, they didn't have a lot of actually wealth, right? But they had other resources like networks. They had resources in terms of spaces. So yeah, I actually collective action, in the view of traditional collective action, right? Formal organizations or individuals, right, with resources are essential. Um, However, right, when in the view of connective action, right, it is thought that because new media now do a lot of that coordination, new media itself is a resource, right? Because your access to your social network, right? Communications to your social network is something that's now done actually quite easily, right? Without, you know, in the past, right, people had to print posters, people had to actually spend a lot of money just getting a message out there, right? And in the context of new media, or rather a society with new media, right? A lot of those resources are now being actually replaced through new media, right? Essentially, every individual has that potential access to the resources, the kinds of networks they need to send a message. And yeah, and therefore, Banner and Sagerberg, they envision that people are moving from collective action to more connective kinds of action, right? Where, yeah, people actually are seeking more personalized paths to concerted action, right? And let me explain a true example, right? Because this is quite a heavy concept, right? Essentially, if you recall, when I explained collective action, I talked about how, in order to participate meaningfully in some kind of collective action, you need to have people who actually kind of agree and understand and is committed to the shared goal, right? That's collective action. But in connective action, right, the argument is that people no longer need to have that to participate. Let me give an example of actually uh, something like, I don't know if anyone has heard of the ice bucket challenge. Um, just a show of hands in the room. Yeah, Trisha. Yes, Sophia. Okay. I think there are people here who have heard of it, right? So, those who have actually heard of it, you may even have participated in the ice bucket challenge, right? I didn't, right? But I definitely watched many entertaining videos of people throwing buckets of ice on themselves. So yeah, I mean, the ice bucket challenge, right, is actually something that came about, right, in support of ALS, right, as a disease, right, is to promote and raise awareness for the disease ALS, right, and one of their the goals of their campaign, right, was to also actually encourage people to volunteer and give to the ALS organization. ALS is actually a disease, right? A chronic and long-term disease. But yeah, it is actually true that there were people who were, uh, yeah, actively contributing to ALS through the campaign. But at the same time, right, there were also many people who were throwing buckets of ice on themselves as sort of a challenge, right? And quite a few very famous celebrities, they were also on that circuit of tagging each other with the hashtag Ice Bucket Challenge. So this is an example of how a social movement, yeah, that's online, right, actually has more complex motivations these days, right? It is no longer, about participants, uh, yeah, participating simply because they recognize the urgency of the problem, or they recognize what needs to be done, and so on, right? People are participating in social movements, sometimes with more personalized motivations. So so yeah, I would venture to say I've never interviewed anyone who threw a bucket of ice on themselves, of course. But I would venture to, I guess that there were many people who were doing it as a performance, right? Because it was cool at that time, right? And it's cool to be tagged by someone famous, and yeah, and they kind of participate in it. They take videos of it and they upload it, and yeah, they take other people, right? So so a lot of these kind of actually personalized motivations to participate in social movements, right? They are actually ever present today, right? In the case of Singapore, all right, we have actually a social movement called Pink Dot, right? That I think Trisha, you must be quite aware of it, right? And Pink Dot is actually one of the few movements in Singapore that's actually very long lasting, right? It is the only one that has lasted for more than 10 years, right? So Pink Dot is actually an annual rally, right? So every June, um, yeah, it is every June or July, right? People go to this assembly square, right? Called Hong Park. It's the only place that Singaporeans can assemble, right? I talked about it last week. And they wear pink, right? And it's a movement in support of the LGBTQ community in Singapore. And everyone who goes there, right, on Pink Dot Day, they wear pink. And it runs from the late afternoon to the night. And at night, they usually light up the entire park, right? It's very beautiful. But yeah, I mean, of course, there are actually people who are part of the community who go there and they really that day is very meaningful for them because it is their day, it is their opportunity to talk about all the discrimination that they suffer, right, in their work, in their personal lives, and so on. But there are also many people who go there as sort of and a group activity, right? And there is a certain identity expression that comes with wearing pink on that day and actually looking cool, right? To participate as a part of Pink Dot, right? There is a certain identity, even though they may not actually identify as part of the LGBTQ community or even have friends or family that is part of this community. So this is what I mean by connective action, right? The condition to participate is no longer just about whether or not you are committed to the social cause, right? In many contemporary social movements, people participate in many forms of collective action, right? Through these kind of personalized connections. Yeah. Sophia, you have your hand raised. Do you want to share?
Oh, no, no, no. I pressed it accidentally.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay.
sorry.
Yeah, I think you pressed it when I was asking if you heard of Ice Bucket Challenge, right?
Oh,
So,
yeah. Sorry.
yeah, no worries. So I think this kind of connective action, right, other than just how people actually can identify with a cause, right, in a very personal way, right? Even though they may not actually necessarily agree with what needs to be done about the problem, right? It's also, I think, something that comes about because of this ubiquity of access, right, to technologies, right? From mobile phones to computers to the various kinds of platforms, it has become very easy to participate with relatively little cost, right, to them. In the past, in the pre-internet era, right, in order to be sort of participants of a social movement, you kind of have to like forgo your day of work, you forgo your day of time with family and go participate, uh, march on the streets and participate in a movement. But it is no longer necessary to do that, right? People can actually be participating in the comforts of their own, from the comfort of their mobile phone. Um, yeah, and I think I've talked about how actually digital media has become like a key resource in terms of actually organizing a lot of the content, right? Yeah, because actually, from the from one individual to like 100 or even 1,000 to 10,000 individuals, right? There are actually features of social media that helps us to make sense of the kinds of urgency, right? The kinds of message that's circulated about any movement, right? So there is this is why Bennett and Segerberg, they talks about this as connective logic, right? Where uh, yeah, contributing to actually this common good or this public action, or, or social movements, right, is actually sort of an act of personal expression, right? You, by posting or retweeting, for me to retweet a post, right? I may see it as actually just me sharing, this hashtag or this particular, change petition, right, to my own social network. But this kind of very low hanging fruit, right, actually is contributing to a wider movement. So, so again, this is why, it is no longer just collective but connective, right? One action, the action of one individual connects to the other, right? And through this multiple form of connection, that becomes scale up and much more, if yeah, massive, right? More massive than we can ever imagine. So yeah, I have actually, shown, I wanted to show this diagram, right, to kind of summarize the kinds of mobilization networks that we see in society today, right? And this comes from yeah, the same scholar who came up with the idea of connective action. So I've talked about collective action, right? This is, right, the figure on your right, right? And collective action, as I mentioned, right, relies traditionally on some a core group of activists, right? A core group of organization, or rather a core organization, right, that is helping to coordinate all the actions, right? And these are actually people who, or individuals or organizations that has access to resources, right? And that is why they can kind of spread the message to the masses. It can kind of mobilize, organize volunteers, right? It can mobilize other people to participate. So that is actually collective action. There are people who thinks that because of the internet, this kind of collective action is no longer present, uh, but I actually disagree, because I think uh, yeah, these actions are actually still very much present today, right? It's just that we now see more connective forms of mobilization as well, right? And there is also in the middle, right? That is actually somewhat connective, right? But some kind of organization is still actually in place, right? So one example is, in fact, Pink Dot, right, in Singapore, right? I consider this as still organizationally enabled, right? But individuals, as I mentioned, may be participating in Pink Dot because of very personalized reasons, right? They are using their mobile phones, they are using platforms to participate, right? That actually, and they may not actually be motivated by, or even be agreeing with what needs to be done about the problem, right? And one of the reasons why Pink Dot is such a long-standing issue is because in Singapore, there is actually a law called 377A that criminalizes sex between gay men, right? And in other words, it can be illegal, right? You can, under the law, people can be arrested, right? Although nobody has ever been arrested, but the law is there, right? So Pink Dot is also is a movement that connects with this issue, right? And the people who, or rather the activists, right, who actually organize Pink Dot, also are always kind of advocating that this law be repealed, this law be removed, right? So that, yeah, gay relations may no longer be criminalized. So yeah, I will venture to say, right, there are people who participates in Pink Dot without actually even agreeing with this solution, right? And that is why, yeah, it is connective in a way, right? But the case of Pink Dot, right, as a rally, as an annual rally, it is still very much actually coordinated by a core group of activists. So it is not completely self-organizing, right? Where there's no organizational coordination, right? Because in the case of Pink Dot, there is still a core group that is actually organizing the rallies every year, that is organizing the campaigns every year. So, but on the other extreme, right, of the spectrum, you have the completely self-organizing networks where there's no core activists, core group of activists, or there's no like organizational coordination of action. So, so yeah, there is actually, I would say, right, in many mobilization networks, right, there's actually a great, huge variety of these different forms. Some are still very much collective, right, where there is like a charity or non-governmental organization or core group that is still kind of mobilizing and coordinating the kinds of participation as well as messages and resources. But there are also organizations that are making use of yeah, digital media, right, to do to actually still mobilize the masses through more connective action. And yeah, on the extreme right, you have the completely self-organizing ones, where there is actually very little or no organizational coordination. So okay, I know we are 10 minutes past the break, so let me just end off with this activity. And I'd like to, yeah, get you to think about this question during your break, your 10-minute break. Now, this is a fun question, so I hope you'll be as creative as you want with it. Uh, can you think of an example of a social media facilitated movement that has been impactful either in terms of sense making or mobilization? So let me explain, right? If you think about the sense making I talked about, right? It's about milling or keynoting, right? How social media helps people make sense of the movement, right? So you can think of an example that actually, helps you to make sense of that. I have used the example of Me Too to describe it, right? Or you're right, you can think of an example of a social media facilitated movement, right, that has been impactful in terms, especially in terms of mobilizing the kinds of masses of people to, in terms of participation, right, participating in the movement. And if you are tackling this question about mobilization, right, please also think about whether or not you think it might be a collective, right, form of mobilization or connective, right? And connective, there are actually two kinds. One that is still kind of organizationally enabled, and the other kind that is more self-organizing. Okay, so yeah, any questions?
Yes, I do. Actually, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So like back to this slide on connective action, when you talk about how personal expression shared over social networks, I was just wondering, are, are there instances where you just share about a certain event that happened and like with your friends over like smaller groups, and do some of these sentiments, are they actually considered too trivial?
Um, I guess it depends on the kinds of sense making that happens, right? So I think when for a lot of social movements, right, that begin small, right, people are usually, I would say, many people are kind of inhibited, right, from sharing because they feel like it's so-called too trivial, right? But as more and more, and this is, I guess, the beauty of social movements and the internet, right? As more and more actually share and mix and actually share similar sentiments and similar stories, right? It will no longer be trivialized. It doesn't become trivial, right? And people start to make sense of them, that this is a collective actually there is a collective and shared uh, experience of the problem. I don't
Okay.
know if that answer your question.
Yeah. I think it helps to situate the because the movements develop over time. So there's different phases. So you're
Yeah.
also saying how when it's developing, it might seem like nothing much is happening, but actually it starts somewhere.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even at the peripheral, but even when movements are being developed, these things they can still be at the peripheral lah, and happening at the site.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I mean, I didn't touch on this in this slide, but the platforms where they are shared matter as well, right? And a lot of actually, I think social movements that go very viral quickly, right? They tend to also be happening over public networks and public platforms.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Mm. Okay, any questions in the room? Sorry, I can't see anyone in the room. No? Okay. All right. Okay, I'll see you all in about 10 minutes. Right. Enjoy your break. We can start? Okay. Yeah. Like, yeah. You coming back.
Hello. Hi, I'm Lorna, and I want to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's a connective, connective action. I think it's a connective action because it doesn't. It starts from incidents, and then people start to share their videos online or their opinions online and to spread the messages and begin to share their own experience and opinion of their own race in different countries. And because of that, people start to post and repost a lot of the slogan and I think they made a kind of a people made their own posts that they design a graph and then but on their own without an organization start to sharing these kind of things with text. So I think it's a connected action and it definitely cause a mobility and a social movement. People go on the street and uh, share that on which days they are going to be on the street and people just join the movement.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, thanks, Lorna, for sharing. Because yeah, I'm glad you brought up the case of Black Lives Matter because that's definitely a very good case of how people are using actually various platforms to share very personal stories, right? Sorry, I think Andrew, if you could mute the microphone. That'd be great. Yeah, because I'm kind of hearing my echo. So, yeah, I think it is. I agree that it is very self-organizing because you don't really see like a very you don't really have a very central group of activists or organization that's actually coordinating the movement, and people, individuals, especially people who are blacks, right? In America, they were using digital media to share a lot of actually their personal stories. And yeah, those examples of actually personal expression really sort of came together to actually yeah, help people make sense of yeah, how Black Lives Matter and the urgency and the kinds of social injustice that is associated there. And I think what's also I think interesting in the Black Lives Matter movement is the counter movement as well, because for this kind of very I think this kind of social movements that's actually tied to uh, a common identity. Usually, what we see is that there's usually a counter movement as well, and that counter movement was All Lives Matter. So yeah, where people started to share stories about how Black lives don't just matter, but all lives matter too. So yeah, this kind of actually personal expression is, I agree, this is very connective kind, an example that's uh of connective action mobilization. Okay, thanks, Lorna, for taking the lead to share. I'm wondering if anyone that's online, right, would like to share. David?
Hi, um, I can share. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. In Germany, there was one far-right, very organized movement called Reconquista Germania, Germany, and they spammed um, all the news with far-right interpretation of such news. And then actually, let's say the German John Oliver, Jamie Oliver, a German talk show master, he actually reported, reported over that network and founded a new movement called Reconquista Internet. So reconquer the internet. So a lot of, let's say, normal people in Germany then started to also comment, let's say, the news on Twitter and so on. So using the hashtag Reconquista Internet. And this was kind of interesting because suddenly in every Facebook news comment, you had actually real people commenting stuff that made sense and not just some weird, uh, conspirative theories.
Wow. Okay. David, that's so interesting. And I really like how this is about actually restoring balance, right, to the internet. Do you mind posting some links, about this movement in the chat?
Yes,
Maybe,
sure.
yeah, we can all check it out later. And I like, your example of how this movement is not just actually a movement that mobilize people to participate, but it mobilized people to make sense of the far right, right? So I think, yeah, the counter reconquer the internet actually was doing a bit of both, right? So that sense making of far right propaganda, far right conspiracy, and also mobilizing others to participate in that sense making. Yeah, thanks. That's a great example. Yeah, and maybe we can have Sophia.
Oh, yeah, I can share about the social mobilization. Like I'm volunteering with this NGO for migrant workers, and it was really the result of the response towards the COVID outbreaks that occurred in the dormitories in April 2020 in Singapore. So this is actually like a ground up movement, and it's actually it started out as a coalition of a few other NGOs who collaborated and tried to pull together their resources and their current networks. And then they also used social media as a channel to facilitate the dissemination of information as well as to call out for volunteers. So I thought that it's interesting to see that social media is like facilitates the means of mobilizing people, but at the same time it also falls back onto the existing networks beforehand, that the organizations that were already in collaboration, and these people, they already had the networks. It was just that it's due to this response towards COVID that this initiative was birthed from.
Mm. So thanks, Sophia. I think you are talking about the COVID-19 Migrant Workers Coalition, right?
Yeah.
So this is actually maybe for those in the room who may not be familiar, let me explain the problem. So there was actually the COVID-19 situation in Singapore was, I say was, right, because it's in the past, was quite contained until the virus
Oh,
got
yeah.
to the workers' dormitories. So we have migrant workers, a huge, actually quite a sizable population of migrant workers in Singapore who come from India, mostly South India, South Asia, like India and Bangladesh, and they live in dormitories. They are very sort of closely packed, right? Not very good conditions. So so the COVID-19 situation was quite contained in Singapore until the virus got to the dormitories. And yeah, that's when we saw like thousands of infection cases per day and so on, which led to Singapore kind of locking down, right? And the COVID-19 Migrant Workers Coalition, right, is actually a group that actually mobilized lots of people to, I guess, uh, actually give their time, but also like provide resources, right? And I don't know if there were also donations solicited.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there were also donations, right? They use new media, they use social media to spread the message about the problems in the dormitories and actually got people to actually mobilize people to contribute to the efforts, right? So it's a case of more new media facilitated mobilization. But I think what Sophia was trying to say is that even though it's new media, it made use of new media, it is still very much a form of collective action where there was a central group of, yeah, actually different organizations that came together to work together, right, and coordinated the efforts. Is that correct, Sophia?
Yeah, this is what it started out as lah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yes, Trisha.
Want to ask Nat, what do you think whether it could be actually including collective and a connective action, and also in that kind of movements could be also sense making plus the mobilization. There's take the Taiwan's LGBT, we have the same-sex marriage legalization. I think in 2019 we passed and then have the referendum. We can see that's a bit very polarized issues that we have the concerned parents plus the religious groups. At the other hand is the LGBT and LGBT friendly groups. And then they all mobilize using social media. I think they have the collective, they have organizations, but they also have alliances, plus they use the social media platforms. And so I try to sort of figure out, is that a clear line between collective and the connected while we are using lots of social media and the new media technologies. At the
Yeah.
same time, I think maybe there's a process like in the very beginning you have to do sense making.
Mm,
Yeah, so you need to tell people what actually this means. To those
mm,
people who are not part of the essential groups, perhaps they have to be, to have the awareness first or persuasion first before they can take any action. Like
yeah.
after the legalizations of the same-sex marriage in Taiwan, we are
Mm,
the Asia first. But these kind of LGBT groups, they did not stop. They continuously to sort of push forward. Like they are foreigners actually married to Taiwan's, but they couldn't actually get their identity and living here. And there's some issues about whether they can have children and so on and
yeah.
so forth. So they need to sort of educate those people who are not part of, they don't really understand what's happening. So starting from sense making, and then they will, I remember they hired a very popular singers to make a very touching like MV post, and then to
Mm,
let people understand how difficult for those couples who live overseas and can reunite. That's before COVID-19. Okay,
yeah.
yeah. So there's lots of issues. I just want to share at the same time. Also want to hear
Mm,
your opinions about what I'm
yeah.
saying.
Yeah, thanks, Trisha. I definitely agree. I think it also is case dependent. I don't think of them as actually distinct types of networks, but actually, as like you said, actually as more and more social movements they evolve, right? I tend to think that there's all kinds. It may start with the collective, right? Actually, in fact, in the example that Sophia shared, right? It actually started from a collective, but I think more and more, right, with people actually using new media to share stories, to actually share their volunteer time, spent in the dorms, there is a certain, I think, aspect of this movement that becomes that I believe over time will become more self-organizing and more connective. I think even sense making, I agree that actually for people to participate, they need to make sense of what's happening, right? So that kind of collective sense making is actually quite central to many people participating in the first place. But I also think that it need not be very sequential, right? Like for many people, right? I know in the case of Pink Dot in Singapore, uh, I had many students who just tell me they go to Pink Dot because it's like, oh, my friends are there, so therefore I go there, right? It's like it's very personal, and they think it's cool to deck out in pink, right, and take a picture on a Pink Dot. But over time, uh, so yeah, they may begin with a very personal action framing to participate, but over time the collective sense making actually kicks in, right? Where they actually begin to make more sense of, oh, this is what this movement stands for. This is what it means to wear pink, right? And even though they actually started out, on a rather personal, on a very personal motivation and personal action frame, I believe that the collective actually can come in later as well. Yeah. So yeah, I fully agree with you that it's not actually distinct types of movement, right? But I think as more and more actually, as a movement matures or it evolves over time, actually we'll see more complexity. So I think even in the case of Black Lives Matter, I mean, it's not there yet. We are not there yet. But even in the case of Black Lives Matter, I think what I also saw with when at the height of the movement, right? What I also saw was actually companies. There are some companies and organizations taking a very strong stand for or against the movement, right? And more, I think when the movement evolves, right, we'll see. Hopefully, it will evolve in a less violent sense, right? We may see more organizational involvement, right? Although I think sometimes it depends on the issue, right? The some issues has participants who are very suspicious or distrusting of any kind of formal organization actually trying to come in to the picture. So I think it's also issue specific actually. Yeah, I don't know if you agree with that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much for all the sharing. And David just posted the link to the very interesting movement that he shared from Germany. Yeah, I really like this. Yeah, I really like this movement because I wish we have more of this. Trying to respond to the online hate. That's a worthy movement in itself. Okay, so yeah, and thanks for all the discussion. In the interest of time, sorry, I don't have time to go around the room. Um, but let me move on, right? In the interest of time. So I just actually talked about Pink Dot, right, as actually one of the, in fact, the only social movement that's actually very significant, right? Sorry, it should be 12th anniversary this year, not 10th anniversary. So it's actually been running for 12 years now. It's the longest running and most well attended. So this is actually just one example, right? By nightfall, right? Every participant, right? They, other than wearing pink, they bring a pink torch light, or they are given one, I think. right? And they light up the entire park in pink. So I still see this as a more organization enabled movement because of the core group that's running the movement. But more and more, I do see that there's still some, actually, especially in the COVID year. So last year there was no, excuse me. So last year there was no rally, right? Physical in-person rally because of COVID-19. But especially last year, we had more people actually sharing the stories, doing using digital media to participate in the movement. Um, in a more self-organizing way, right? Yeah, because of the lockdown. Excuse me. Excuse me. Okay, I don't have COVID-19. I promise you. I just have a scratchy throat. Okay. Yeah, and I won't belabor this point. Yeah, I was glad that Lorna brought up Black Lives Matter, right? And but I guess want to actually make use of the Black Lives Matter movement to talk about the sense making a little bit, right? Yeah, especially if you look at actually the kinds of hashtags that's used to keynote the movement: Black Lives Matter, BLM, Blackout Tuesday, Black Power. So all of each of these hashtag, right, actually uh, has either a call to action or symbolic meaning attached to the hashtag, right? Blackout Tuesday, Black Lives Matter. Blackout Tuesday, for instance, right, is actually sort of symbolic, right, in terms of actually Tuesday being marked as the day to do their protests, right? Black Power, Black Lives Matter. Actually, the words itself actually, is actually is impactful, right? They are impactful in terms of shaping how people saw the movement, right? Yeah, and then there were also counter movements that I mentioned, like Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, that emerged in response to the Black Lives Matter movement as well. Um, so having talked about mobilization, right, and how I think by now you should get the big picture, right, in terms of how new media can be used to effectively mobilize all the different voices, all the agenda in the public sphere, right, and mobilize people to participate in them. All right. I don't have the statistic here, but I have come across studies that show how, yeah, just how there are so many more social movements in the internet age, right? Now with the internet, right, compared to before. Although many of these movements, they are more temporal, right, in a sense. So by this I mean they actually start up very quickly, but many of these movements can also uh, sort of end or decline very quickly as well compared to the past. Um, so what does this mean, right? This also can mean that people may also be mobilized because of disinformation campaigns, right? And I can't stress enough how serious this topic is, right? And I believe everyone in this room, you're taking this module also because you understand how serious the problem is, right? The problem of disinformation. Um, I just want to, I guess, start off this discussion of this information by playing a video here. So this video was produced for a series of dialogues I was a part of hosting last year. Was it last year? No, the year before last, right? Because last year was COVID year. The year before last. And this is a series of dialogue that happened in over 70 countries. I think, yeah, I don't think Taiwan was part of it, but uh, there were dialogues, right, that were organized with citizens about various aspects of the internet. And there's this particular one I was leading, this dialogue I was leading, which looked at the internet as a public sphere, right? Especially in the context of this public sphere now being filled with disinformation campaigns. So I'd like to play you this video that was produced as part of this dialogue, right? Here you will see actually responses from citizens from different countries, right? About their thoughts about the internet as a public sphere, as well as basically, their thoughts about what needs to be done, with respects to disinformation and misinformation. Okay, so I hope you can all hear the sound, right? But please let me know if you can't. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that video. There's a lot to think about and unpack. I know it's 3 o'clock. So I will let you all go and for a 10-minute break. But before you go, I'd like you to just think about the everyday examples of information that turn out to be false, right? That you've come across. I know I have definitely come across some, especially in the COVID year, like conspiracies about masks, conspiracies about vaccines, and conspiracies about whether or not the COVID-19 virus was true or not, was a fluke in itself. But there have been many other uh, I guess pieces of disinformation, right, or rather misinformation I come across that were part of the a larger disinformation campaign, right? So when you go for your break, just have a think about this, right? When we come back from the break, I will invite you to share some of these examples. So okay, with that, I will just stop sharing my video, right? And enjoy your 10-minute break. I'll see you in a bit. Is it okay to start? Okay, right. Okay, let me start with, since we have about just 50 minutes left. So if you remember, I ended on the note on the video on, sorry, let me just go to the next slide. Yeah, on the video on disinformation. So in a while, I will invite everyone, I mean, who has examples to share their examples. But before we do that, I just want to, I guess, clarify some terms, right? I know that in the video you've seen some people use the term fake news. In fact, this is also a term that many people use to refer to disinformation. But I do think that it is very important to make sure we are using the right terms. So personally, I recommend against using this. Oh, okay. I think thanks, Sophia. You said you can't see the slide. Let me. Okay, can you see the slides now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, awesome. Thanks. Yeah, I didn't realize I wasn't sharing. Okay, yeah, as I mentioned, I do believe that it's very important to use the right terms. I tend not to use the term fake news because I think it's almost counterintuitive, right? News is news, right? There's nothing fake or true about news. But I mean, this term, as we all know, without evoking the name of a certain US politician, right? He in particular actually made popular this term fake news by calling CNN that. But I would recommend that we don't use this term, right? Because I think it's more accurate to refer to falsehoods, to falsehoods as either misinformation or disinformation. So disinformation, right, deliberate, right, and the distinction between misinformation and disinformation has to do with whether it's deliberate or not. A lot of us actually can fall prey to misinformation because we didn't know that it was false, right? And when we spread falsehoods, right? That's misinformation. because we tend not to know that something was false, right? Many of us would not share something if we knew that it was false. However, this information in particular, right, are usually campaigns that are undertaken by insidious or yeah actors with ill intentions. They are deliberate. They are deliberately false information campaigns, right? Who are intended, right? And the reason why these actors spread this information, right, is because they want to manipulate public opinions in the case of an election. Sometimes it could be because they want to maximize profits. In fact, this is not new. Especially in healthcare, in the pharmaceutical industry, right? There's always this some kind of disinformation against competitors, right? Many for-profit companies do this, right? To try and manipulate yeah opinions about their own product or the products or services of their competitors. So I do want to make sure that I clarify these terms, right? And I also have one point here about freedom of expression. And this is actually, I think, central in our discussion about how we tackle this information, right? Because, if you look at a lot of the discourse and discussions about what people do about this information, there tend to be a lot of also concern about whether or not these tools or these strategies to combat disinformation can limit the freedom of expression. And yeah, I mean, depending on the society or social political context you come from, this conviction about freedom of expression is greater or not so um, um, uh, not so great, right? And in some societies, this freedom of expression, this value, right, is highly protected. In some societies, it is not so valued as highly, right? And this translates these differences in terms of the concern or the commitment or conviction about freedom of expression, right, is manifested in the way we see how different societies think about solutions to combat disinformation, right? So yeah, I just want to clarify that right before we go into a discussion. So can I invite anyone who has an example to share about some kind of misinformation or disinformation you heard? Maybe someone in the room or Lucas. Oh, Lucas, sorry, we can't hear you.
Okay, now you can hear me.
Yes.
Regarding disinformation, there are many examples. I see them every day, especially regarding propaganda in a political context. But maybe an example from my side regarding misinformation. So in my spare time, I also work as a paramedic, first responder, like in emergency services, and we often get called to some kind of emergencies. And afterwards, you can read on Facebook, some people are discussing what happened, and they constantly spread misinformation. And you read things that never happened there, and you're like, where did they get that information from? So there's a lot of gossip then happening. And this is sometimes a bit weird, annoying also. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Lucas. I have a question. I mean, out of curiosity. So when these kinds of misinformation comes up, right? What are the ways to actually address them? Like, are they asked to take down that information, or are they like made to? I guess. How do people actually report these cases?
The difficulty here is with the GDPR, so the data protection laws in Europe. So actually, I'm not allowed to say anything because that
Right.
would violate the, for example, victims' rights here.
Right.
What, for example, the fire services are doing, the fire department, they have actually a website where they report on the emergencies, and they have like strict regulations what they can say there. So this kind of reduces the gossip here.
right?
but you can't take down any opinion
Mm,
voiced on
mm,
Facebook. So there you can only say, no, that's not true. Something else happened, but you can't
yeah.
say actually what happened. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong. I think in Europe, right? The freedoms of expression is also highly protected, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
They
As
are
well as
right.
personal
Yeah.
data.
At least in Germany, they are trying to do some laws regarding the propaganda part, so regarding disinformation, but it's a
Mm.
very difficult legal perspective regarding the freedom of, right to express.
Yeah. 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 Thanks, Lucas, for sharing. Right, I will talk
Okay.
about how it's actually tackled in Singapore in a while. And I mean, this is really, I think, I really enjoy your Germany example, right, and the connection to the European GDPR, right, because this would really also show how the context can be so different, right, and it matters in the way different societies think about solutions to tackle this information. Yeah. Uh, anyone in the room? I can't see anyone, so okay. Maybe can Andrew can help to unmute the computer and turn it around maybe. Yep.
Let's see here.
Switch on the camera.
Just can.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. In terms of misinformation, recently I had a Taiwanese media house report on activity that I did, and they quoted me, and it was something that I never said. And so I had to correct them. So that's the misinformation I experienced, and disinformation.
What
I
kind of
remember when
message? What kind of message?
no, they said that
Kind
I
of
said
media.
that no activity has ever happened like this before, and I never said that.
Oh.
Yeah. This
Oh,
disinformation. I remember the Hong Kong protests when they were being reported one way and then being reported the other way in China.
mm,
Yeah, I remember those. Yeah, that's it.
wow. Oh, thanks for sharing. Yeah, actually, I did a study of misinformation in a riot in Singapore before, where I found that actually the media was responsible for circulating a particular piece of misinformation. And what happened was that actually the media, it was a major newspaper in Singapore, right? Actually corrected very that false information very quickly. But what happened was that people remember the misinformation more than the corrected information. And the thing is that, and the thing is that actually when it was first circulated, actually it didn't gain much traction at all. But the moment the media actually reports it, people started sharing that misinformation, and actually it became much more, believable because the media actually were circulated it, right? So yeah, I mean, going back to the, one of the earlier slides, right? If you remember, that's why I said I think the media still has a very significant role. It's not that the internet, right, with the proliferation of the internet, the media no longer has a role. They still play a significant role in terms of actually shaping the public sphere and what people believe, right? And just anything that comes from the media is that much more believable, right? Even though anyone on the internet can publish anything essentially. So that's that's something, yeah, I want to share. Yeah, yes, Trisha.
Yeah, I would like to share because you just mentioned about the role and the role of the mass media and then how
Mm,
it play actually to actually push the intermedia agenda setting from disinformation, and then even people will believe the credibility. Like I think a couple of years ago, that's one diplomat in Osaka, because there's I think tsunami passed the earthquake, and there's some rumors talking about Taiwan actually has some arrangement in terms of sending out our own, maybe citizens in a different way compared with China. So it's sort of blaming our diplomat in Osaka did not do a good job. But that information traced down, basically it started from Weibo, from Weibo in China, and then it was posted in the beginning is the youth league of the China's something like a little pink, which is the youth army, internet army from China.
Yeah.
But when the information being picked up by PTT, PTT, right?
Yeah.
PTT is a forum in Taiwan, and that's one young people thought there was a real news, and then he started to sort of sending out all the information without knowing that it's a disinformation, and then caught a lot of attention, and then mass media started to capture because the online popularity of that news. So eventually the diplomat committed a suicide because he faced lots of stress, and he felt very responsible for that. But later on, all the things has been clarified, and that's not true. That's not really happening in Japan. And then Taiwan diplomat has handled very well, and China did not really has a better measurements to send out their own citizens there. So yeah, the other thing is like media. When they said that someone said something and then with a huge like online, value, and they think that's news,
Yeah.
but they did not really do the, I would say, credible checking, the fact check
Yeah.
responsibility, and then it become part of the, I would say, the tool to actually push the false, I would say, false negative effects on all
Yeah.
these. Yeah.
Yeah, it really yeah, thanks for sharing. I think it really points to the crisis of journalism right now. In the past, right, a lot of I think journalistic training has been about how do you actually come up with an engaging story, for instance, how do you actually report news and all that. Whereas I think in this internet era, right, I think there has to be a lot more about doing fact checking, doing proper investigations, and also not falling prey to attention, right? The economy of attention. Yeah, so it is really critical, right? And I this leads me nicely to what I want to talk about, right? About QAnon. I think many of you should be familiar, but uh, in case there are people who are not familiar with Q, um, let me explain this movement. And this is actually a perfect case to actually really, uh, I guess, illustrate the complexities, right, in terms of disinformation, the kinds of mobilization it can lead to, as well as the role of different players, different actors in this whole case, right? So Q actually began, I mean, the conspiracy, right, in QAnon, in the case of QAnon in the United States, actually began with Pizzagate. So if you're not familiar, right, Pizzagate, right, there's this conspiracy that it began with, right, where they say if you actually look at the tweets and and the postings of people like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and these are all like Democratic uh, people from the Democratic side, right? Who are regarded as left wing in the United States, right? And the conspiracy is that if you replace the word pizzas with little girls, uh, you can actually construct the conversation to see that they are all talking about eating children. So yes, that's actually the conspiracy. It's madness. But it actually began with that, and it slowly led to actually those who actually began believing in QAnon, right? They actually began with believing that people like Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, they are they are part of this cult that eats children. They are cannibals and so on. So yeah, it began with this one conspiracy, and it began with in a gamified way as well. So whoever that actually was spreading QAnon conspiracies, right? They will actually gamify it, right? They will go to messaging bots and they leave little clues and all that. So it's a bit of like a game. And people who actually are QAnon believers, they will go to these messaging bots and look for Q, right? The word Q to look for this to unveil these conspiracies, right? So it began as a very small group, but the number of conspiracy theories began to spread, and as well as the number of people who actually believe in them, right, slowly spread when uh, many of these QA non-conspiracy theories, right, they also moved to more mainstream platforms, like like Twitter and Facebook and so on. Later, they were all taken down, but it kept moving, right? And the believers and the theories, right, the conspiracy theories actually kept moving to other platforms, right? When they got banned from one platform, they would move on to another one. And over time, right, you can see that more and more right wing, people who support the right wing um, parties and right wing narratives, right, began to actually support QAnon, right? They became supporters and believers of QAnon. And all these conspiracies, right, are no longer seen as conspiracy theories, but they actually became rational things to believe in. Yeah, I mean, we have seen the effects, right? We have seen photos from, for instance, the 2021 January Capitol breach, right? You have seen like all these people who are dressed in the QAnon sort of costumes, right? They are believed as the QAnon shamans, right? They appeared in a Capitol breach, right? So for those who are not aware, this was a breach of the Capitol building, where yeah, all these mobsters, right? These protesters actually stormed into the Capitol building in the attempt to take over Congress, take over the Senate, right? In the attempt to actually stop the announcement of the former, installation of Joe Biden as president, right? And yeah, there was even like sort of a call to hang Mike Pence, right, amongst the mobsters. So if you're not aware, right, if you go to actually go to YouTube and search Capitol riot breach, right, you'll be able to see a lot of these videos that actually had people waving the Q flag, and yeah, people dressed in this kind of QAnon costumes, right? They were storming the building. So this is actually, I wanted to highlight this case, right? Because this is an example of how the disinformation can lead to the mobilization of people who believe in disinformation campaigns. And I mean, it wasn't just the Capitol breach, right? There were also signs of that before the January 2021 breach, where at many Trump rallies, right? This is the middle and the picture on your right, right? At many Trump rallies, Donald Trump rallies, you would see people kind of holding up the Q symbol, as well as, yeah, people selling T-shirts, talking about, yeah, Hillary Clinton as a cannibal, or even Obama as cannibal eating children, or how Donald Trump is believed to be the savior of America, right? And that's why there was such a violent uh, rejection of Joe Biden, right, as the next president. So because yeah, many people actually believed in these conspiracies. But I think, going back to the media, role of the media, right? If I think I strongly believe, right, based on my observation of QAnon and what happened during this whole time, right, especially during COVID year when people started, to spend a lot of time on the internet. But I strongly believe that even actually without the media, in particular Fox News, that was also helping to spread many of these conspiracy theories, right? People would not actually, I mean, the this particular group and all the conspiracy theories, right, would not have gained as much traction. Uh, because, yeah, I mean, here's what I observed, right? When all these conspiracy theories were being circulated on Fox News, in particular, there were also uh, interviewees that they got, right, that were QAnon believers, right? So they came on air, they were given airtime, and they were also talking about these conspiracies, right? Not necessarily Pizzagate, not the original one, but talking about Donald Trump as the almost like the Messiah, as the savior. And it wasn't just one channel. There were also like radio programs and all that that were actually coming from the far right that were also supporting and actually repeating some of these conspiracy theories, right? So this is, yeah, I mean, I think the link between um, disinformation and mobilization, and it is concerned with our public sphere, right? I think earlier this year I was interviewed on the radio, right, where one of the radio DJs, she was asking me, right, whether I believe that um, something like QAnon, right, will have an effect on a country like Singapore, right? And my response is, I think, what do you think? Right? What do people in the room think? No, right? Someone unmuted yourself. Is it
I
Sophia?
don't, I don't think so. I think a couple, maybe 2018, Ping-Hua was invited, to Taiwan, and then talking about fake news and disinformation. And he
Mhm.
said Singapore had no fake news. The only fake news actually is about the fake rice. The fake rice that old people they out of goodwill to sort of warn the young generation be careful to not to eat fake rice, but that's
Yeah.
not intentionally. So I don't know. Can you tell us how clean that Singapore is?
Well,
And you have the regulation, do you? Malaysia has
yeah,
the.
we do. Yes. So I think in Singapore, well, Peng Hua is very positive. I think he hasn't spent enough time on the internet. But but it's true. I think my response to the reporter, I mean to the radio DJ, was that I don't think something to the scale of QAnon will ever happen in Singapore. Right? Singapore, firstly, is much too small for any particular marginalized group, right, to be ignored completely like that. I think it's important to remember the reason why I mean, QAnon, Q itself, right, gains such a wide following is because there's this group of, I think, people in the United States, right, who has for a long time resented the rise of the left, what they see as the left-wing agenda, left-wing politics, and they are tired of it, right? So they feel like their voice is not being heard, and that's why, when the right wing came up, right, it was a very uh, convenient group to believe in because they feel like finally they are being heard, right? Finally, their voice is being expressed and they are being included, right? So yeah, so I think it's important to remember like the context as to why people actually started believing this kind of conspiracies in the first place. So in Singapore, I don't think we are big enough, right? Ever big enough or diverse enough to have that kind of group being constantly ignored. The one group that I think that is actually constantly marginalized, right, in Singapore, because largely because of the law that's against them, actually is the LGBTQ group. But even they have a voice as well, right? And they have a community. It's not like they are being ignored. So I don't think actually something like QAnon will ever uh, come to Singapore or take root, right? But I do think that there are falsehoods circulating in various contexts. So I see that a lot in the health context, with like various things being said about like imported food from China and from Malaysia and so on. So especially in health, actually I see a lot of falsehoods. Yeah, and especially in the over the last 1 year with COVID, right? Lots of disinformation associated with COVID. So that's actually, the Singapore case, right? But I do want to, I guess, talk about the kinds of solutions that different societies have come up with, right? And that's why I asked Lucas, right? When he shared about the misinformation, right, that's circulated, I asked about what's being done there, right? So let me break down this table for all of you so that you can make sense of it, right? I think in terms of solutions, we can think of it as the who's working on it, and what they are doing about it, right? So on the who, right, I think we can think of it as three levels, right? So this slide was something that I came up with together with the leads from the internet dialogue. We came together, so it's about 70 over people who work on this particular slide, right? Where we try to make sense of all the solutions that actually our different societies have come up with, right, to tackle this information. So there's actually different levels of action, right? There's the public bodies, which are typically governments at the national level, or even international organizations like the EU and the United Nations. There is the private sector companies that are trying to do something about this information as well, right? Because yeah, as I mentioned, falsehoods have always existed, right? Especially competitor against competitor, right? And sometimes, I mean, for a very long time, even before I went to academia, uh, I was given like accounts to spy on the dark web, right? To spy on, actually, not okay, not spy, but look at actually the kinds of um, uh, information circulated on forums and the internet, right? And this was a time when even we didn't have social media as we know it now, right? They were more like messaging bots and so on. So for a long time, I've seen a lot of this information by for-profit companies, right? Although it's never clear what's the source, because it's always about covering your tracks, right? You can see that a lot of this information actually exists against uh, in the private sectors. And then there's another level of action, which is actually civil society, right? And civil society, actually, you can think of it as academia, yeah, journalists, media as well, right? And on the other spectrum, it is about what they do, right? On one level, there's education and educational campaigns and empowerment, right? And another level of action, it's about, I think, type, or rather another type of solution is about trying to make sure that the content is of high quality, right? And this kind of efforts, right, can be both, can be either human based, or it can be technical, right? And another type of solution is to have a law, right? In Singapore, we have a law called the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, right? And this is actually an example of a legal solution. And yeah, another solution could be recourse, right? Where you enable users to actually file complaints about disinformation and so on. So, and the last, right, is about actually sector-led commitment, where the industry or the organization actually try to come up with a commitment or a sort of terms of services to prevent the spread of disinformation. We don't actually see that a lot, in Singapore, I would say even in Asia, right, where we have this kind of sector-driven sort of organizational led commitment, right? But we actually see quite a lot in terms of legal solutions as well as education, right? So let me explain some of the cells, right? So you understand what I'm talking about, right? So in the case of Singapore, for instance, we have, as I mentioned, the protection of online falsehood and online protection from online falsehood and manipulation act. So this is actually something that I would see. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I would see as something that falls under a legal solution, right? That's undertaken by public bodies, because this is a law actually passed by the Ministry of Law, right, in Singapore. So it's a legal protection, right? And what happens in POFMA, for short, right, is that when something is actually ordered to sort of, or rather recognized as a falsehood under POFMA, it is a requirement for the source to actually take down actually issue a correction notice, right? So they need to put up the original post as well as a post to clarify what was wrong with the post. So yeah, the content is not actually taken down, right? But we don't really have a lot of like private sector led disinformation yeah yeah, solutions, right? The one thing that I think companies like Facebook is doing, right, is that they are trying to make sure. I mean, a lot of, I think, the solutions that you see coming from the private sector, like the big tech, like Facebook, um, Twitter, WhatsApp, it falls under sort of the second column here, right? Trying to make sure the content is of high quality, right? To prevent disinformation from spreading quickly, right? So this is actually both human and technical intervention, right? Where they have algorithms to recognize what Facebook would describe as coordinated and inauthentic behaviors. So I've attended a meeting with Facebook before where they try to explain what this is, right? They don't want to reveal what's exactly in the algorithm. Of course, this is proprietary information. But what they say is that their algorithms will be able to pick up whether or not like one particular a series of accounts is coming from particular IP addresses, right? Then they trace that to the source, right, to recognize that as inauthentic activity. And they also pick up, the algorithms will also be able to pick up activity like the spread of of the same kind of message across multiple bots and accounts, right? Again, that's more a kind of technical intervention, right, to try to make sure the content is of high quality, right, and to prevent the spread of disinformation. And I think, I mean, this again, right, is more private sector led, right, where there is also human fact checking going on, right? So there is an organization called or rather international body called the International Fact Checking a network of which I'm a part of, right? So IFCN is actually an international body that endorses fact checkers. So there's actually many stringent standards, right? To be one has to go through in order to be endorsed as a fact checker by IFCN. So although anyone can technically fact check, right? But Facebook in particular only endorse fact checks by fact checkers that have been endorsed by verified by IFCN. So so there are some fact checkers. They are actually in every country, right? But I would say that in Singapore there's no IFCN verified fact checker. Right, and this has also to do with IFCN's own principles, right? So IFCN is actually established by the Poynter Institute, which is a US-based research institute, right? And they have very strict standards in terms of and beliefs in terms of what constitutes independent fact checking. So so I can share more if there are questions about this, right? But I can tell you if it varies from yeah, making sure that there's actually no funding coming from government or any particular political parties to yeah, making sure that yeah, across like the 12 or 24 months of fact checks, right? There's no bias shown to any particular powers that be as well. Yeah. I think Trisha, you have a question.
I just want to share quickly that IFCN, I would say, certified award-winning. Taiwan, we have one. It's called TFC, Taiwan
Yes.
市场合中心, actually led by some scholars and third party, and they had done fantastic job, even with a very small amount of human power. So they got recognized by the global
IFCN.
organization. Have you heard of it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
actually quite well known. I think it's one of the um yeah, more established and well known fact checkers in Asia. Yeah.
One more thing to add, because you are talking about the sector-led commitment, and Line is one of the most popular social media platform, and it causes lots of disinformation problems because it's
Yeah.
a close-knit group. And but Line said they cannot really intervene because they only have end-to-end encryption. So for the message, they also work with the fact check organization and some civic engineers. They develop some apps called 每日一 or called fact. Basically, you can add this app to your group, and they will help you actually to clarify whether the information you are you feel doubtful or interested actually is true or not true. So that's a personal effort or individual effort or group effort. So Taiwan has lots of this civic participation in terms of ICT. Yeah.
Oh, that's really, really great. I think this is a great example of civil society, what civil society can do, right? And the kinds of solutions they can come up with. It's not just like awareness campaigns, building awareness, but actually coming up with technical intervention, right? To make sure that the content is actually fact checked. This kind of civil society kind of efforts, right, I would say is very much missing from Singapore, right? I feel, and there's really a lot more we can do with that. Sophia, you raise your hand.
Yeah, I wanted to say that for Singapore, because just now you were talking about PUFMA, the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. But the important thing is that for this law to actually be executed, actually it's that the powers lie under the government, and it's the government who actually gets to decide whether what is being said is actually true. So what was problematic is that during the context of like general elections 2020, there were some instances where opposition candidates actually had what they said online, like kind of like say that they were wrong, and then they were forced to post a correction of what they had posted online, which is a bit I mean, if you think about it, if like in the context of election, you can't, then in that sense it curtails free speech.
Yeah.
So while you try to have all of so while some people can have the authority to speak, then who gets the right to choose what is right is also problematic.
Yep. Thanks, Sophia. That is a nice segue into the next video I wanted to show, right? Which is my point about who do we trust to regulate this problem, right? There are some people who say, oh, government should, right? But how can the government, or especially a government that has political interest, right, be independent of its interests? Because, yeah, like what Sophia was saying, POFMA itself was a legal solution, but how it is implemented also matters as well, right? In the case of Singapore, right, to sort of say that something is false, right? The responsibility lies with the minister or the ministry, right? Or rather, the ministry that's actually led by a minister that's from a particular political party, right? So especially when during a context like an election, you can see how, yeah, the political interest can actually be priority, right? Because they are trying to win an election, right? So what matters is actually I mean, who is trusted with this responsibility. Um, Without jumping on the gun too much, right? I strongly believe in how this information has to be multi-stakeholder, right? It cannot just be something that's led by one particular party. I also think that when it comes to platforms, the law itself, a legal solution itself, right, while it can have uh, uh, it can punish and correct, right? It cannot be used to prevent. So education empowerment is really important, right? Literacy campaigns, awareness campaigns, and also I think something that comes from civil society at large, right, is incredibly important because that lends whatever solution it comes up with, right, some legitimacy as well. So the question of what constitutes a falsehood, right, is also something that I feel cannot be just be something said and recognized by government, right? It has to be multi-stakeholder as well, which means that the body itself to recognize that something is a falsehood has to be independent, right, in some way, right? So this leads me to my next video, right? And this I won't play the whole thing because I think we don't really have a lot of time left. But I want to play this video and highlight the issue of trust, and then we can move on to my last slide. So yeah, I can share the link to this video, right? When okay, sorry, I just lost my screen. I can share the link to this video so you can watch it on your own. But yeah, you get my main point, right? My main point is that who has the trust of, or who should be trusted with regulating the space. I don't think it can be any one particular group, right? As I mentioned, I strongly believe that it has to be multi-stakeholder, right? To be a check for each other, right? And what kind of platforms actually matter as well. Something like POFMA, as we can see, like actually like what Prof Trisha shared. When it comes to instant messaging, disinformation on instant messaging platforms, it is very limited. It cannot really check on the kinds of disinformation there. You can't even check the source or even do something about it. So it really is about civil society. What can civil society do in terms of actually doing something about the disinformation they come across? So, okay, I have just 2 minutes left. I just want to explain the after class activity. So yeah, thank you all for bearing with me, the past 3 hours. I hope that, yeah, in my rush to go through all these concepts, it made sense to you. But yeah, this is actually something that I think you have thought about just now already during the break, right? What is one example of either disinformation or misinformation you have come across? On which platform did you encounter it, right? What was done to address it? More importantly, in your opinion, what can be done to address disinformation and or misinformation, right? To address this final question, you can make use of this table I have posted, right? That gives you this big overview of solutions that's out there undertaken by different societies in terms of battling disinformation. In your opinion, right, what do you think is most crucial, to address disinformation and or misinformation that you see? Okay, so this need not be very long, right? Post your reflection, no more than 200 to 300 words to eMoodle by end of this Saturday, right? Yeah, that's it. Any questions? I will post the slides in Teams as well. Yes.
I really like the very complex table that you have, and because it's like the collection of the mindset from different experts internationally. Can you give us the source?
Yes.
Like then
Oh,
later on,
the source
expert.
actually came from the We the Internet dialogue, citizens dialogue, that was a part of, but I can give you the full paper on this as well.
And for the video that you share, is that available on the internet,
Yes.
the YouTube? Okay,
Yeah. I
thanks.
can share the source. Yeah.
Sure, great. Any
Okay.
questions?
Any questions?
So that's
Okay. If
very
not,
wonderful session.
yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. If not, I will see you next Monday.
Okay,
Thank
All
you.
right.
Have a good day.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye
Bye.
bye.